Hi everyone, and welcome to the Get Wise webinar. So I left Christian Science, now what? Today we're going to be talking about facing our anger. We're really glad you're here. This webinar is part of the Get Wise project, explicitly addressing the psychological damage from years of indoctrination in Christian Science, and is sponsored by the Fellowship of Former Christian Scientists. My name is Catherine Baimesha, and I'll be serving today as our moderator. If your experience in Christian Science was anything like mine, we were only allowed to be happy and grateful. Anger wasn't allowed. Because of this, many of us never really learned healthy ways of expressing our anger or engaging it. After leaving Christian Science, many of us find that we're overflowing with anger. Even rage and unregulated anger can be debilitating to our life and to our relationships. Others have bottled up our anger until suddenly we explode, and this unhealthy response can be similarly destructive. Facing our anger is an essential part of the recovery process from Christian Science. In fact, not facing your anger can keep you stuck from moving forward in your life. So today we're going to discover that anger isn't all bad, and it can be appropriate and valuable to express our anger in healthy ways. It's even essential to express our anger as part of working through our past in Christian Science. So I'm excited to get started, and I'm thrilled to introduce to you today our teacher, Jeana Roth. She's a licensed professional counselor that specializes in spiritual abuse recovery. She is also a guest teacher for our Thursday night Get Wise support group, and I'm just so thankful for Jeana's friendship and her expertise and deep compassion for us as former Christian Scientists. I think you'll really enjoy what she has to share with us. And Jeana, we're just so thankful that you are here today.
Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. We are in the series, So I Left Christian Science, Now What? And today we're going to be talking about facing my anger. I am Jeana Roth, and I am a counselor in St. Louis, Missouri at Revision Christian Counseling. And today we're going to be talking specifically about anger, and specifically from the context of Christian Science. So I just want to give you a little bit of background on me and why I'm here teaching today. So this is my family. Yeah, we're enjoying life in St. Louis and having a lot of fun. And you can see there we're playing in the leaves, so we get out and we play a lot, hike a lot, all of that stuff. Professionally, I am a counselor here in St. Louis. I'm licensed in the state of Missouri. I'm also a member of the International Cultic Studies Association, or ICSA, and that's where I first started getting interested in working with people coming out of cults and religious spiritual trauma. I'm also a non, so I am not Christian Science background. I did not grow up within Christian Science and only came across it as an adult, as I've been intrigued by some of the backgrounds of people I've been working with. But I have been studying it actively and working with people from Christian Science for several years now. I've been a guest teacher within the Get Wise program through FFCS, and have also done previous webinars and conferences as well, both as a participant and as a speaker. So I really enjoy working with this population, and I'm glad you're here. I'm really glad that you chose to join in with this topic. This is a topic that has come up several times over my time working with Christian Science participants or former participants. Just to give you a little bit more background on me, you'll see there at tearsofeden.org. That's a nonprofit I helped start with the purpose of creating community for those coming out of spiritual abuse more in general. I work from an attachment framework, use EMDR and DBT, and everything I do is trauma informed. So that's just a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap for today's seminar as well. So following our introduction and trigger warnings and a few notes on our approach, we're going to be headed into 3 different parts with today's seminar. The first part is that emotions background. So think of it like Emotions 101. You may have caught my previous webinar on emotions coming out of Christian Science. And if so, this will be a little bit of review, but I just feel like it's foundational before we dive in anger specifically, that we have a little bit of a background on emotions in general and what their role and function is. And then we'll go into part 2, which is the nature, role, and function of anger. And we'll do that specifically from a Christian Science point of view. What are those things that make Christian Science more prone to that anger and or expression of anger that may feel different or strange or overwhelming in a lot of cases. And then finally, we're going to go to part 3, which is practical ways that we can express anger safely and in healthy, constructive ways. Let's go ahead and move on to some trigger warnings. So just want to own a couple things up front, just so that you know where we're starting from, and just to prepare you in case you do need to turn your computer off for a bit or pause or come back to it at a later time. That makes a lot of sense, right? When we're working with trauma, these triggers do come up from time to time. So let me give you a little bit of a peek into what might come up. The first thing is vocabulary. So we do know that there will be terminology used today that may trigger your past trauma and or views held within Christian Science. So in order to mitigate the impact of this, just please ask questions. Sometimes I don't even know I'm stepping on a landmine until I've already stepped on it and it's blown up. So feel free to take notes and follow up with me or with Katie at any time. And please know also that my intent is not to promote CS values, but to help you to start teasing apart those meanings. And also to share maybe at points how particular terms are used more within mainstream culture. So I just want to give you an example of that. We'll be talking about emotion regulations, obviously, with emotions coming up as our main topic today. Emotion regulation, it may come across like we're trying to help you not feel that emotion, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Emotion regulation within mainstream culture simply means that when that emotion is out of proportion to the precipitating factor, that's when we would want to regulate that. And we also want you to feel like you're in control of your emotions. So being able to shift or to tolerate the distress for a moment, to bridge you to a time where you can deal with that emotion more adequately is definitely the point. The point is not to say that the emotions aren't good. In fact, quite the opposite. We're going to be talking about how helpful emotions are and how we should create space for them in our life. The second trigger warning I have is in regards to faith and religion. I just want to own up front that I do come from a faith background, and I currently hold to a faith system. This webinar, however, is not explicitly religious-based programming. Because Christian Science is a religious system, however, is considered by many people, including myself, to be a cult. We may at times mention the faith system in practical application to recovering spiritually. So just feel free to consider a more generalized higher power if you're not currently in that space and currently maybe don't identify with a formal faith system. Also, I think it's really common to not engage in any faith system or religion for some period of time, short or long, after leaving a spiritually abusive one. So just want to encourage you to give yourself that time and space. And just know that that's never my intention to trigger you into a space where you feel pressured or pushed or anything like that. Okay. Finally, let's talk about the approach of this presentation. For the purpose of transparency, we're going to assume 3 things about today. We're going to assume that Christian Science is a cult, and you can see previous webinars by the Pardons and by me for more information on that. I think the Pardons did a webinar where they went through Clifton, like all of the different categories of cult behavior and what different things might qualify it as a cult. So if you want to go back and check some of that out, you could. We're also going to assume that it's traumatic to leave a cult. So that's the framework I'm coming from, is there's trauma in your brain, and that's not something you chose necessarily. And even if you did, there's probably specific reasons why. But a lot of people who are part of the Christian Science tradition actually grew up in it and they didn't have any choice. So this is something that happened to you and not something that you had choice in that. And so there is a trauma connected to leaving a cult and rewiring your brain in that capacity. And then finally, trauma impacts your brain and can be rewired. So we do believe that neuroplasticity exists through the entire lifespan, and as such, your brain can be rewired with time and energy and specific work, whether that's with a counselor or on your own. And I just want to own those things up front, that's where I'm coming from. I'm also coming from the perspective that Christian Science is occult and has a negative impact on a person psychologically, as well as relationally, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and so on. Because of the religious nature, this would also be classified as spiritual abuse or systemic spiritual abuse or religious trauma. There are lots of different terms out there that you might use for yourself in order to describe what you've been through. All right, let's get started. We are in part 1. Let's talk about emotions. Emotions in general. Let's just do some basic background and kind of get an idea of how we're approaching the limbic system and all of these things. Okay, so emotions are housed within the limbic system in your brain. They are experienced through your nervous system, which is a physical expression of those emotions. So if you think about your brain, on the outside part is your cortex, and then inside that is that layer of the limbic system, and then finally we have your base brain or reptilian brain, that is where your amygdala and hippocampus and a lot of the fight or flight responses actually come from. So while emotions are experienced interpersonally, they are read through nonverbal communication such as facial features and body language. In fact, it's your body reading emotions most often, and it's processing them really without the involvement of the cortex. So, the purpose of emotions is to communicate to others, to communicate to ourselves, and to motivate us to action. These things are needed for physical, emotional, and social survival. So those are just some of the basics, right? We're just going to talk through some of these basics. If you look on the screen now, I'm putting up a feelings wheel. So this is this is common within my field, obviously, but just want to help you understand how to read a feelings wheel if you've never come across one of these. There in the middle, you'll see, I think there's about 7 different categories. This is actually where each wedge of the pie it originates. So you can see bad, fearful, angry, disgusted, sad, happy, and surprised. Lots of different feelings wheels out there. This is just the one I happened to pull up, and it's one that I tend to prefer and tend to like this one. But everything in those outer 2 sections under each wedge would be more specific ways to describe that category, right? So you may feel fearful, but there might be other ways to describe that. You might feel anxious, you might feel rejected, you might feel persecuted or worthless or worried, overwhelmed, frightened. So there's all of those different pieces that could be, whether we consider those synonyms or slight different meanings depending on the word. The English language has an amazing array of great vocabulary for us to be able to talk about these feelings. And so that's kind of how we would treat a feelings wheel in general, is that the category would be more in the center, and then you get more specific as you go outward. All right, so let's talk about what it's like to experience emotions after growing up in Christian Science. Okay, so from everything I've learned, and again, I'm not above being wrong on any of this, but I have pulled in quite a bit of information from people I've talked with over the years, but only certain emotions are generally allowed within Christian Science. So there is an emphasis on the positive, and you're allowed to be happy, but not necessarily all levels of happy, right? We talk about in some of the groups I've been in, we talk about that kind of that blank face, but with a smile, right? But a smile that doesn't feel genuine to the people who are perceiving that smile. So that might be some of how other people perceive you, and kind of how you've been trained to experience emotions after growing up in Christian Science. The other thing is there's a danger in emphasizing the positive. So devaluation of the whole person, right? If you're only allowed to feel one particular thing, then you're speaking a different language than non-Christian Science in the wider culture are speaking, right? We might have all 7 of these categories within the broader mainstream culture, but within Christian Science, we've really boiled that down to just one category, and even that category, we're losing a lot of the nuance in those different expressions of different types of happy. As a result, we lose the ability to feel some of the rest, right? There's this saying within my field that talks about you can't numb selectively, right? So when you numb everything. So we think we're just holding on to the happy and we're getting rid of all the quote bad emotions, but that's not actually true. We're actually numbing everything. And this is true for a lot of people in faith systems. There are iterations of this that happen within mainstream evangelical circles, Christian circles, for example, the prosperity gospel, Christianese, anything that involves that kind of spiritual bypassing where you're not actually allowed to go into those deeper emotions, but you feel more compelled to focus only on the positive. So I just want to also say that you're not alone in that. There are lots of ways that can present in different contexts. And then what you might notice after growing up in Christian Science is that, like I said, you can't numb emotions selectively, and then over time or with multiple generations, a lot of that emotional vocabulary can be lost. And so that can lead up to a really numbed out state. That brings us to internal discord, where your body is experiencing the emotion, but you're not having any language for it any longer. Maybe you're noticing complete numbness. Maybe you're focused on thinking only, right? So in effect, we've shut down part of our brain and not allowed our brain to access certain part of the human experience. Okay, so what I'm proposing instead is that we could think of emotions instead of being good or bad, instead of being these things that are going to get in our way or cause problems for us. We could think of emotions as dashboard lights. So if you think about your car, there are lights within your dashboard that help you understand what is happening inside the vehicle. Similarly, we could think of emotions as dashboard lights that help us understand what is happening inside ourselves, right? So this requires acceptance of all emotions and a shift towards emotions not being good or bad, not that dichotomous thinking, but instead just saying, what is this emotion telling me about what's going on inside of me? So it removes judgment. It helps us to approach ourselves with curiosity and kindness. It helps to repair some of that connection we have with ourselves, right? As we honor our space and honor, however you're coming at it, I would view that as, imago Dei, or being made in the image of God, or having some sort of, divine design. Really, however you're describing that, that helps us to put more emphasis on the fact that we are worth knowing, right? And if we're able to use that curiosity and kindness with ourselves, that's actually going to help our relationship with ourselves, help us to trust our own gut more, and help us to have confidence moving forward in how we interact with the world. So today we're going to use this approach as we consider anger. Anger is something that comes up all the time with Christian Science. Okay, so before we go there, I'm just going to give you, this is a slide that I wanted to include. We talk about anger, but there's also lots of different emotions that we can talk about that you might be curious about what their different roles might be. When we're talking about anger, the role of anger is to expose perceived or real injustice, right? There's a little bit of a question there. Is it real? Is it perceived? And we'll get to that in a little bit. But that's what it's exposing, right? That's its role. That's its purpose, is to help us understand injustice. And it motivates us towards action by helping us to correct that injustice. Okay, so as you can see, I walk through anger, fear, disgust, sadness, shame, guilt, jealousy, envy, love, and happiness, all of which are really important emotions and have different roles and different motivations towards actions as we learn to get to know ourselves and to get to know other people. So again, that's just included there more for your information, and I just wanted to kind of point you to that in case you're interested in looking at it further. All right, let's get started on anger. I know you guys are waiting for this. So many people have expressed how excited you are for this webinar and for us to talk about anger. I just want to, as you can see in this slide, the nature, role, and function of anger, I included two of our cultural references for anger. These both come out of cartoons, obviously. So the first is the Angry Birds, right? And the second one is the anger from Inside Out. This is the expression of anger, and it's actually a really interesting movie if you haven't seen it, to think about the role of emotions and how emotions can play out in within the brain and the wiring of the brain. But one thing I noticed when I look at these two cartoon portrayals is anger's red, anger's fire, anger is it's mean, right? And so we're gonna shift that just a little bit. Anger does not always have to be mean. It can be a very powerful emotion, but it doesn't necessarily have to be coming from a place of hate or from a place of trying to make somebody else feel lesser or trying to hurt somebody else. In fact, that's not the ideal use of anger. So we're going to actually talk about what it is and what it does. So if you can see, I've blown up that wedge on the feeling wheel where we see anger. Let's talk a little bit about anger. Anger is a strong emotion, and it has protective and even combative qualities. Anger can be aggressive, assertive, or passive aggressive. Anger often serves as a secondary emotion when you feel you can't express a primary emotion. So let me actually pause for that for a second, because this is something that's actually really unique about anger. Because anger is so strong and it is so protective, we can often miss out on some of the nuances of why it's there. So let's say you're experiencing a fearful emotion, something that's making you feel scared or anxious, right? When you're not feeling safe to express that fear, when maybe you are, so like if we go back to fear, and that expresses threats to our life, health, or well-being, but maybe we're not able to express that. So then a lot of times anger will come in, and it actually represents a secondary emotion. It's expressing the injustice that you can't express your fear. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say primary emotion and secondary emotion. A lot of times anger is actually filling the secondary emotion space, because the primary emotion is one that feels vulnerable or weak or less powerful somehow. Okay, and then anger has a range of intensity. You can notice in these words anywhere from let down to frustrated to hostile. Anger gets a bad rap since it's often connected to the actions people take in their anger. So we might see that play out as somebody using their anger to lead to violence, outbursts, and very out of control feelings. But that is not the core of what anger is and what it does for us. What does anger do? So let's go back to that roles and motivation towards action. So anger helps us expose and have energy to correct a real or perceived injustice. We really need our prefrontal cortex, like we talked about earlier, that outside part of our brain. We need our prefrontal cortex online in order to know whether the injustice is real or perceived. If it's real, so for example, maybe somebody's being bullied, right? That's an injustice. And that's something that we might feel angry about, right? I don't know how many of you are parents, but if you've ever seen your child be bullied, that evokes anger so fast within me. And it's something that you would feel physically and viscerally in your body prior to being to having any sort of action come out of it. Like you would know that you feel angry because somebody's being bullied, and your mind does a quick check. Is this injustice? Yes, this is injustice. We need to stop it, right? We need to stop my child from being bullied in this way. What about perceived injustice, though? This might be not getting something I want, even though I'm not owed it. Maybe I didn't get a job, but maybe there was somebody else more qualified than I was. So it's not always, it feels like an injustice, but it's not always a real injustice. So that's where we need to actually do some fact checking and go through and make sure that the injustice we're feeling is real. If it's not real, that's when I need to actually deal with my own feeling of entitlement or my own feeling of fear or pride or whatever those things are that I'm feeling that might be hurt at that moment. Right, so I kind of drew this out just to hopefully help make this a more streamlined process. So what do I do with anger? I kind of broke it down into 5 different steps. So identifying anger is the first. Checking the facts is the second. Action urge is the third. Choosing a path forward is the fourth. And then finally acting on that anger. So let's go through those one at a time. The first one being identifying anger. So using the feedback that you're getting from your body, we first identify the anger we're experiencing. So you would notice your thoughts, your feelings, your body sensations that point toward the emotion, resulting in us naming the emotion anger or frustration or whatever the specific iteration of that emotion is. Okay, so that's identifying the anger. And then second, we check the facts. Anger exposes real or perceived injustice. With the above phrase in mind, consider that injustice. Is there a real wrong here or a perceived one? If it's real, then we proceed. If it's perceived injustice, then we explore those underlying feelings of being wronged. Okay? Action urge. What is your action urge? What do you want to do? Consider those fight, flight, or freeze options. Remember that anger gives us a strength. It gives us some energy moving forward, some momentum to be able to act in case there is something we need to do with that. But what will make the biggest impact in fighting the injustice? Okay, and then choosing a path forward. Again, we want to keep our whole mind engaged here. So trusting the emotional and logic parts of your brain. There are pros and cons to any action you might take or not take. Just weigh those, right? And the more we are able to employ the cortex in that decision, the better. And then finally, we're going to act. We're going to move forward. Once we act, we might find we didn't do it perfectly. That's really normal too. So if needed, we just evaluate and fine-tune our responses for the future. Did this help to resolve the injustice? If not, what might help more? Things like that. Okay, let's go through them again. Again, I just want to repeat these things because as we talk about Christian Science and things that are going to lead to anger, I just want this process to feel really, really normal and natural to you. So let's slow that down a little bit more. What does anger feel like in your body? Where do you notice it? Do you ball up your hands into fists, or do you tense your muscles preparing for a fight? Or maybe you notice your temperature rising and your breathing speed up. For comparison, how is this different from anxiety or fear or even happiness, right? We experience our emotions within our body because that's our nervous system expressing those emotions there. Okay. The second one was checking the facts. Anger exposes real or perceived injustice. When we experience anger, there is an underlying experience that the situation, circumstance, or outcome is unfair in some way. If it is, then we want to use that anger to correct the unfair thing. That could be protecting somebody who is vulnerable or righting a wrong. But if it's not actually unfair, but it still feels that way, we might use this as an opportunity to confront our own sense of deserving, entitlement, or whatever that might be. To do this, we must zoom out and gain a broader perspective. Context helps us to determine whether an injustice is real or perceived. We can also ask others who may have a different perspective on the situation. Again, zooming out and getting multiple viewpoints on it can be really helpful in that respect. The next stage is action urge. Go back to your body and understand what that emotion of anger is motivating you to do. So typically with anger, this will be a fight, flight, or freeze response. And some of those bodily effects you can see there in the diagram. Your heart rate might increase, your bladder may relax, tunnel vision, flushed face, dilated pupils, shaking, dry mouth, slow digestion, hearing loss. I mentioned early, like your hands balling up into fists. That's a real thing, right? Your muscles shaking or having that extra energy in your nervous system. So that's something you can be watching for in your action urge. And then finally, choosing a path forward and acting. Engaging in mindfulness here means employing your whole brain. Make a decision and follow through. And when it's over, go back and evaluate how effective your approach was for accomplishing your goals. Was the injustice corrected? What do I have to be angry about after leaving Christian Science? Well, the short answer is a lot. There is so much injustice in being raised in a cult. And there's so much injustice at not having any choice in that matter. You may feel angry at your parents. You may feel angry at your grandparents or whoever first got into Christian Science. You may feel angry about everything, and just this is the first time you've been allowed to feel angry, so it might just be coming up all the time. Some of the specific things I kind of pulled out: gaslighting. Are you angry at having gaslighting used against you? To have that truth sort of re-narrated for you, and not being taught to take in things about your body, or not being taught to take in how your emotions were feeling in your body, or that you're allowed to have emotions, or that emotions weren't just good or bad. You might feel betrayal. Right? You might feel like you've been lied to, because you have been. Right? It may have resulted in distorted reality. You may be angry at you having to do all of this work when you didn't choose this. Right? You may be angry at the language that's being used. Maybe that language is misleading. One of the things that I've learned a lot from Katie and from the FFCS group is that sort of the redefining of these terms, right? If I say spirit, or if I say truth, or if I say lots of different things, it's going to mean a different thing in Christian Science than it does to the rest of mainstream culture. So all of those things are definitely worth being angry about, right? And they all represent that injustice. If we were to check the facts on these things, they're real. These things are real, and they are real hurts. And you know what? Those injustices were never corrected. In a lot of ways, the injustices you feel coming out of Christian Science were never made right. Of course you're going to feel angry. And when you're first starting to feel angry, it's unusual, right? It feels bad, and you're having lots of judgment about yourself. I shouldn't feel this way. I should, right? I shouldn't do these things, or I should do these things. I just want to create space for you to be able to observe that, and to notice that that's coming from the fact that this injustice was never corrected. We also need to talk about retraining your anger response. Okay, so while it might seem artificial and overly cognitive to analyze all these various aspects of the emotion of anger, it's actually a really important part of the rewiring process. You learned one thing growing up in Christian Science. We are harnessing that neuroplasticity and new synaptic connections in your brain, and then rewarding appropriately so that those new behaviors become the norm in time. Right? This takes a lot of time. If you think about it as pathways in the jungle, right? The first time you are trying to blaze a new trail, it's going to take a lot of time. We're going to go slow. We're going to be cutting down vines. We're going to be, maybe marking trees. We're going to be focusing a lot of attention. In time, the ones that we use become well worn. Right? And that becomes a reward in and of itself, and that we're able to choose that pathway again. And a lot of it is not based on choice. A lot of it happens automatically. But we're going to hopefully help teach you how to do that in really practical ways. It's also important to go through this process with a lot of self-kindness and non-judgment. It's really, really, really hard. And it takes time and energy to rewire your brain. So giving yourself grace and being patient with yourself in the process is going to make it a lot easier in the long run. That being said, it's never easy, so don't hear me wrong when I say that. Let's go on to part 3. So we're going to talk about some really practical ways to express anger well, especially coming out of Christian Science. I don't know how many of you, I saw this graphic with the car and the fist and and I just thought, keeping your cool and managing your anger, that's a big deal. That's a big deal for everybody in our culture. And then add to that the fact that you were never allowed to do that. And no wonder that anger feels like it's exploding all the time, right? Really, really normal. So let's talk first about how to cool down your brain. Okay, so we know that from trauma-informed practices that we need to first soothe and regulate your brain stem and midbrain. So remember, the cortex is on the outer part, then limbic system, then that kind of brain stem, base brain, reptilian brain, whatever you want to call that. There's lots of different names for it. We need to first start there, at that inner part. We regulate by calming the body, right? So a bottom-up approach, helping to calm our body, slowing down your body, helps to calm the base brain, and then again we can move towards those other layers of the brain. This might include taking regular, slow breaths, just slowing your breathing down. right? There's a couple other techniques that I have used with some success, using a cold pack, right? Literally cooling down your brain, right? Our body heats up with stress and trauma. We can actually cool it down from the body up by using a cold pack. Another way is to activate the dive response. So if you think about diving into cool water, if you were to put a bag of cool water right in front of your over your eyes and forehead area, that actually helps quite a bit. It's just kind of harnessing, again, these body hacks of trying to help harness your natural body response in order to help regulate those emotions. You can also try stretching, punching a bag, doing some sort of intense exercise to try to get that energy out of your body. The second stage would be relate. So the second step is to connect through a tuned, sensitive relationship. Empathy and validation help us to feel seen, heard, and understood. And then finally, we can reach that part of the brain where we do our thinking, right? So we've gone from the base brain to the relating part where we're connecting and having the emotional experience, the limbic system, and then finally out to the cortex of our brain. Finally, we can start to use that part of our brain where we're doing our thinking. Using this bottom-up approach works with your brain instead of against it. And it's not going to be as effective or helpful if we try to reason when we're dysregulated and disconnected. Okay, so this is all based on Dr. Bruce Perry and his 3 R's, reaching the learning brain, and all of that. He does a lot of work with attachment and brain neuroscience too. Another skill that's going to be really helpful is mindfulness. So to understand anger and what to do with it relies heavily on our ability to know what's happening, where in your body, why it's coming up, and what you want to do with it. It's so important to hone that mindfulness skill and to be comfortable understanding your own body signals. It makes a lot of sense to be angry after leaving Christian Science. Mindfulness includes truth-telling to yourself. This is how Christian Science hurt me, right? And here's how I feel it in my body. This is how Christian Science has hurt me in my body, in my emotions, and in my mind, all of those things. I talk a lot with my clients about becoming an emotion detective, right? If we were to think of ourselves as super sleuths, as we were to think of ourselves as Sherlock Holmes, we don't stop till we understand it. There's some piece maybe that still feels like, gosh, I can't quite grab onto it. But if we keep going, if we keep pursuing those answers, right, eventually we'll come to an understanding, right? It might mean pulling in experts. It might mean seeing a counselor or working with somebody who can help you understand some of those emotions and give you some extra information that you might not already have. Also learning to be comfortable sitting with the emotion. Don't rush past it. Don't push it down. Don't try to get rid of it. Just explore it and actually let it have some space, right? One of the things that you might try is trying to externalize that emotion a little bit, like pulling that anger out. What color is your anger? What shape is your anger? Right? As we explore those different aspects of the anger with curiosity, you're also accepting yourself, and the anger that you feel is important, but it's not you. It's not defining you. You are not angry. You're experiencing anger, right? And that's another point, actually. Name it to tame it. We talk about, in the trauma world, whole brain child, Dr. Dan Siegel coined this phrase. How opposite is that from what you learned in Christian Science, though, right? Name it to tame it. In Christian Science, you're not allowed to name it, right? Naming it makes it real. It gives it power. It makes it more likely to hurt you in the long run. That's actually not true, according to neuroscience and brain, what we know about the brain. David Rock also says that you can reduce stress by up to 50% just by noticing and naming your state. Just by naming anger, you can actually reduce stress and the stress that anger is causing you by up to 50%, just by noticing and naming it. Okay, and I gave you some sources there. Feel free to go check those things out. But definitely name it to tame it. That's what we talk about in terms of the brain. Another thing is don't bottle up your anger, right? The fastest way to resolve the uncomfort that anger can bring is to sit with it, learn from it, and take action appropriately. In contrast, the more you push it down, ignore it, pretend it isn't there, or otherwise don't heed your dashboard light of anger, the more it will rear its ugly head. This is the Christian Science default and likely how you have been trained to deal with your anger. Unfortunately, this makes you more susceptible to the type of blowups that you're fearing. This can lead to verbal explosions, physical or violent explosions, and can cause harm to those around us. That image of a volcano is so accurate. You're going to explode if you try to push it down, ignore it, and pretend it isn't there. Okay, so the best way through it, the best way to get rid of it is actually to go through it, right? To learn how to sit with it and learn from it in ways that are really helpful. Regulating anger that is from perceived injustice. So if you find yourself acting on perceived injustice regularly, that might be a sign that there might be some important work that you could be doing in counseling to get at those deeper roots. So consider doing a deep dive into your story, into your family of origin, or even into your worldview to understand where that's coming from. Katie and FFCS run a great Get Wise program that can give you lots of opportunity and space to be able to start to process those things. I'd encourage you to reach out if that's something where you feel like you're stuck at. Use the resources around you and rely on those of us who've been working with this stuff, who have been reading the research, and would love to help you get back on your feet and get moving in the right direction. Another last reminder, and I'm saying this because a lot of people have reminded me that this is so important. Just remember, anger is not bad. Being lied to is something to be angry about. I'm going to say that again because I want you to hear that. Being lied to is something to be angry about. You need to feel angry about that. If you haven't let yourself feel angry about the type of betrayal and deceit and just the impact of the cult that Christian Science is, you might be missing something. Okay, so take that time and explore that anger. Use that anger as a tool to get in, to understand yourself, understand your own experiences, and start to work on that relationship that you have within yourself, to trust your gut. The more accepting you are and the more curious you are about why it's there, what is happening, and so on, the more you will be able to benefit from the opportunity that anger provides us with. It helps us to look more deeply at ourselves, spend time in introspection, and often step out in protection of those who are more vulnerable. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. I know that in a minute here we'll be transitioning to a time of question and answer, and I just want to encourage you as you're taking on this process and this tackling this big topic of anger. Right? Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the chance on me to be able to explain about anger and maybe where that might be coming from, what it might look like, and what we might be able to do with it. So I'd love for the opportunity to answer some of your questions. And then if there's anything else that comes up, I've also listed my email address, and you can also contact me through Katie and through the FFCS organization. So I look forward to hearing your questions. Go out and enjoy your anger, and let us know if you get stuck anywhere. Thanks so much for being a part of today.
Well, thank you so much, Jeana. This was just amazing. So helpful. Thank you so much for all this information. And it really just speaks so much to our experience. I feel like those pictures you gave us just describe so often the former CS experience, either kind of the overflowing, angry person, or the volcano where everything's being stuffed, and then suddenly that exploding anger response that's unregulated. Those pictures are they really gripped me. So thank you so much, Jeana. This was really great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we hope people will send in questions. And, one question, just as we begin here, you talked a little bit about this, but, that after being taught to stuff our anger for so long, it can be hard to access it. And that picture you showed too of like where you might feel something in your body, but not be able to name it. Maybe we're not connecting it with anger. Could you speak a little bit more about like accessing your anger and what that looks like?
Yeah. So accessing your anger, it's a big question. It's a great question.
Yeah.
So starting to let those things come out, it does start small. It starts with just noticing where, like what you're feeling, and then starting to connect that to, am I angry? Right. So using that curiosity that you have naturally to lead you into that space where you can ask questions of yourself, right? Ask questions of other people. Did you see me as angry there? Right. So I think as soon as you start to name that, then we can say, okay, when I was angry, where was I feeling that? Or maybe you start with the body and you just notice those things too. But depending on where you're getting stuck in that process, we can use some of the other pieces to help guide us towards better understanding, which I'm now realizing could be a trigger word. So I'd love to, I'm kind of reading through that in the chat here. But yeah, definitely don't want that to be a trigger in terms of understanding. But as you get to know yourself, right? As you get to know your own body and emotions and in your mind, like there are pieces of that are going to help you engage with the broader context around you. So that's more what I mean with that. Yeah, I'm so intrigued. There's a couple different things that were said in the chat in terms of the synonyms. Yeah, the synonyms came up too. There are only 7 synonyms. Okay. Yeah. So again, with that, I mean, we can just expand our vocabulary, right? So just if you bring up something like a feeling wheel and are able to talk that through, I know like I use that a lot with my kids. And so being able to just pull out that feeling wheel and kind of having nuanced, like, well, how is anger different from frustration? And how is frustration different from discouraged? And like all of these different things that we might not think about, they're kind of philosophical, because when we start talking about semantics, they're not necessarily clear cut. But yeah, just I think the more we talk about them, the more we're going to be able to get ideas of what those things look like and how they're different.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, I think part of this is just having that vocabulary right. And start connecting. And so if that becomes one of the options, oh, maybe I'm angry, then we can start, being curious about that, being a detective, as you said. So yeah, so maybe a lot of it's just been because we just didn't have the words to verbalize. Here we have another question. So this is coming from someone coming from a evangelical Christian background. And she says, there's a premise that all anger is sin in some Christian circles. So I have a big problem with this. What do you advise?
Yeah, I have a big problem with it too. So I push back on that all the time. And I would just ask that question, like, are you sure that's sin? Right. I think there are some pieces that we could point to even within scripture. So as somebody, I mean, I do have some familiarity with that background. And so I usually push back and say, well, Jesus was angry, so was Jesus sinning? Right. So I think that's a really great question to start with, because if it sort of breaks down somewhere, right? Either anger is not sinful, or Jesus was sinful, and that changes the whole premise of Christianity. So I think the most logical conclusion is that anger is not sinful. It's what we can do in that anger that would be sinful. So I like to tease those things apart and just talk about how the anger itself is actually pointing us to injustice. And if we're using our anger and our energy from anger to correct that injustice, whether that's flipping tables or protecting somebody from bullying, that's actually a really good use of that emotion. And it's actually a righteous thing. So that's how I would push back on that.
Yeah. So we may find that outside of Christian Science, there's also unhealthy ways of stuffing or dealing with anger.
Absolutely.
We're not the only ones.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. Yeah. Here's another question. What are some ways I can support the Christian Science influenced people in my life with anger without necessarily confronting them on Christian Science? Specifically people who tend toward bottling up and exploding. So often we're still working with Christian Scientists, Christian Science family members, and they're still coming from that perspective that all anger is wrong. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah. I think the most helpful thing I've learned is just to help them calm their body, right? So like, hey, do you want to take a walk with me? Or do you want to throw this ball with me? Or, there, especially when you're working with kids, but even with adults, like you can take a walk with somebody and that can help start to calm down their body, which will help them to deal with their anger indirectly. And then, ideally, we'd be naming that and then starting to process that and connecting, but you are still doing the base brain and the limbic system functions within that context if you are helping them sort of distract and calm their body and then being with them in the process. A lot of times with anger, we want to isolate, and that's not always helpful. So if there's a way that we can stay present, a lot of times that's more helpful in the long run. You could also ask some curious, just probing questions to poke holes at stuff. Like I would say, wow, it seemed like you were really angry. Wow, that you seemed really frustrated with that. I wonder where that's coming from, just some sort of rhetorical type questions that you're not necessarily expecting an answer to. Might be good ways to push back on that without actually having to confront the Christian Science part.
I think that's really good advice, because I think often they just haven't named it for themselves. And so if we can start naming it for them or kind of being curious, that can actually help them grow in those things as well. As we get healthy, the people around us sometimes get healthy too.
And it helps us practice as we're starting to point those things out or trying to manage that with other people too, right? Sometimes it's harder to see it in ourselves. It's easier to see it in somebody else. I don't know.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think if we can start to see it, then we recognize it more quickly, and then we're more likely to have that non-judgmental approach of, oh yeah, we're just going to go calm down. Or an example I use with my kids is like, I will throw them an ice pack, again, just to help them cool down, and they catch it because that's what our reflexes do. Their body catches that automatically, and then they're already starting to calm down by the time they're like, why did you throw me this ice pack? And things just start to calm down. So there are lots of ways you can do that. I would just be curious and try experimenting with a few different things. Find out, obviously we want to do that with respect and kindness, but if there are ways particularly that you can try to push in there and find an entry point, I would recommend doing that.
That's really great. Here's another question. Someone says, can you say something about dealing with the effect of feelings from other people's angers as ex-Christian Scientists? So sometimes we're talking to other ex-Christian Scientists that are like really angry, and that can be triggering to us. That can be hard. He says, I often feel overwhelmed when I experience people expressing anger, and I think it triggers old feelings of not knowing or being taught how to healthfully respond to other people's angers. It can feel more overwhelming than it should be.
Yeah, great question. Because anger is a little contagious, right? So like and remember when we talked about primary and secondary emotions, if one person is feeling anger, like my response to that might be fear, right? That might actually scare me. And then I need to go through, why am I feeling that fear? And again, go back to that list of roles and functions and motivations, and see what that fear is doing maybe in the moment. If you're able to stay separate and not get sucked into that anger, sometimes it's helpful to actually empathize, right? To pull in together and say, like, what is this person feeling? Is that right? Is that a real injustice that they're feeling, right? And then we almost like band together as a community to fight that injustice. That can be helpful. It's also really tricky. So just being able to parse those things out and keep separate space for yourself and for other people it's admittedly very, very complex. And so I feel for you in those situations. And I know that that's huge because anger is so big for ex-Christian Scientists. I have so much empathy because you're going to mess up, right? And so being able to have that approach where you still try is really hard. I'd encourage you to keep trying though, because it is worth it. it's worth it in some contexts, right? You might come across people who are never going to change, or that is just, being aware of yourself to say, I need to take a step back. This is not helpful for me right now. I need to turn off my video on this webinar, whatever it is, like that's you knowing you, and that's being mindful in your own self about who you are and where you're coming from. That's to be applauded too. So maybe just celebrate whatever those pluses are at any given point. And instead of the shoulds and sort of the condemnation that can come with it, to really encourage yourself to keep going. Like, hey, I did my very best today, right? That wasn't easy, and I was able to stay regulated, or I was able to engage with that person's anger, or I was able to let that anger be their anger and not pull it onto myself. Again, wherever you are, just to acknowledge where you've come from, and remember to milestone that journey too.
That's really helpful. Yeah. And what about someone who maybe it's worried about going there? Like you have anger, but it just feels so scary. Like you're just going to never get to the end of your anger. Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, the picture of the volcano is for those of you who are in that boat. It's not going to get better on its own. If we think of it as, I'm interrupting the process now before it becomes this like explosion of volcanic energy, that might be better. That might be more helpful, right? So just almost weighing the future cost of, what if I don't deal with it? What is this going to do to me? How are we going to get to that next step?
So basically, I think what you're saying is like, it's not like you can just never deal with this anger. Right. And it's like you will deal with it at some point. It's just a matter of when and how much, and if it's going to be done in a way that where you actually can regulate it. I mean, if it's exploding, then you won't be able to do that. Yeah. Right.
And when you're exploding, you also don't have control over who that's hurting. Right. So if we can catch it earlier, that is really a kindness to the people around us, especially if you're exploding onto your family, they're not responsible for the thing that's making you angry. Right. Like then your explosion becomes an injustice. Right. And so we end up making those things worse and compounding them. My approach is always, hey, let's try to tackle this in a more controlled environment and more controlled way to dismantle, almost like we're going to dismantle this bomb instead of just letting it explode and see where it goes. Right. So we're going to take that chance and try to dismantle it before it gets there.
Yeah. Well, and with that too, someone asked here, does everyone here feel like they have anger issues? And, I guess that's a good question. If you've come from a place where there is no anger and now you're starting to feel some anger, how do you know if you have an anger issue? How would you even know that?
Great question. Again, if you've been gaslighting yourself for years, you might not even know those things. Maybe this is the first step. Maybe here today and kind of poking on those things, maybe having your other ex-Christian Scientist friends, former Christian Scientist friends, poking on those things with you and for you, and keep bringing them up to your awareness. Maybe that's where you start. Yeah, but it is a problem. It's not a problem because anger is a problem. It's a problem because we're not dealing with why anger's there. And it's the underlying thing that's going to end up hurting us in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's probably something, because it can feel so good to be angry if you've never been allowed to. But then if people around you maybe are saying, oh, I think you're angry a lot, or maybe taking cues, or even asking someone around us, like, do you feel like I'm angry all the time? Or that can help.
Being curious. Yeah. I mean, people may tell you, or they may be afraid to tell you, they might just start avoiding you. And then, just to kind of follow up on some of those things, like, hey, why'd you walk out of the room? Oh, because you were angry. Oh, okay. So, even anytime we can get feedback like that, information like that, that's helpful. Ask a child or a teenager, they'll tell you the truth. They don't have the same social parameters that we develop as adults. So.
It's true. Yeah. Someone here says, my experience in CS is the only bottle that is that only bottled expressions of anger were acceptable. And there was no modeling of healthy anger. And I think that's a real issue, Jeana, for us, because I remember that too. I mean, people would, like, it was kind of acceptable, that bottled, like that explosion in anger. And then we'd all kind of, in CS terms, know the truth about it. And it would just suddenly, we'd all have to pretend it didn't happen. And so that's kind of how I think anger was expressed, at least in my experience of Christian Science, and learning that actually isn't okay, right? I mean, that's not a regulated way of dealing, or a healthy way of dealing with anger. So if we're doing that, kind of continuing that Christian Science way of dealing with anger, that's like, it would be better if we dealt with it, right? I mean, that's actually an anger issue if we do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, that's, it's you're getting stuck in the process and it's always coming up to an explosion, right? Like instead of that just kind of coming out and there being good flow and being good, good movement with the anger, right? So where the anger is coming up and then it's promoting that action against injustice and then it kind of subsides, right? So that's the normal cycle of anger, is that you have it, it points out the thing it needs to point out, and then you resolve it using those skills that you have, right? So then you use your energy towards repairing the injustice when that works well. If it gets stopped or halted along the way, like it gets a little, I don't know, like almost, it just gets stuck. Almost like an emotional, like it's kind of a crude example, but almost like an emotional constipation. Like it just slows things down, right? And then nothing's functioning optimally, right? We want there to be good, regular movement. And yeah, apologize for the crude example. That's really the only thing that was coming to my mind as you said that.
Well, yeah. I mean, and I think that's where your graph was really helpful in kind of helping us. Maybe we should start earlier to start addressing it, or even just being curious before we, or doing that detective work earlier on in the process, so that we know, should we be, or not should, but like, is this something that is wrong? Is this something to be angry about? And so maybe, we just need to be a little bit more intentional about checking into those things and checking into our body and just paying attention to how we're responding. Yeah. Let's see. And I think a lot of it is even owning the fact that we've been wronged. I mean, some of the things you said, like naming some of the ways we've been wronged by Christian Science, is really helpful to hear someone outside state those things. And I think that's a lot of our work in our Get Wise support groups, is trying to name just exactly like how we've been wounded by this destructive group. So talking with other former Christian Scientists can really help. Talking with a counselor can really help. What are other ways, Jeana, if we need help, just kind of validating the fact that we've been, that there's been injustice towards us? I mean, journaling.
Yeah, journaling is great. And we're in an age where a lot of people don't like to write stuff down. So I would even recommend an audio or voice to text journal. Like that can sometimes get more of the stream of consciousness piece of it. But anytime you're writing it down, you're drawing, you're doing art about something, I would encourage you to talk. I mean, obviously I'm a therapist and believe in counseling and the value of that. Counsel, it's just helpful to talk things out sometimes and to process that with somebody else, to say, I'm thinking that I don't know how to name this, or I don't know what to do with this. And then that person can fine tune with you how to get you unstuck in a specific area. So I would go that route. If you're interested more in this approach to emotions, I work with DBT. So you can look up DBT resources where you are and see if you can find a group or a counselor who works in a DBT informed way. Anything like that is going to help to, again, you're practicing these skills so that when you need them, you already have them there and ready to go. It's all about being prepared and again, using all of the resources you have available to you. And your body is amazing, and our brains are amazing, and they really are meant to help us process these things. So yeah, I think that's part of the disconnect too, is I think you can trust your gut. I think you can know what you need and kind of listen to your body tell you what you need.
Yeah. And in safe places. So like talking with a counselor about that, and you could say, I wonder if I have bottled up anger. Do I have that? And maybe in that safe place, or to talk about something that you are angry about, and they can walk you through facing that in a safe way, rather than in the moment when you're triggered and unregulated, feeling everything.
And they can help validate. I think that's the other thing. Like I see a lot with Christian Science is even if you kind of have an idea of what it might be, there's not a lot of confidence in that just yet. So even just to have somebody else say, yeah, I see that too. That's huge, right? It's just really, it's really helpful to have that validation. Like, okay, I kind of took that all in and I figured out what I wanted to do. Like this counselor's not actually doing a whole lot. They're just telling me, yeah, you did it right, or here's an area where we could maybe have some different options or whatever. But that gives us the encouragement to keep doing it. And the more we do it, again, those pathways through the jungle, we're going to keep those pathways strong. And that makes us more likely to be able to do it in the future. So, so keep up the good work. If you're just starting on the journey, like we get it, right? We're all here with you. And this community is huge and would love to support you in that process. And if you're further along in that journey, see if there's someone else you can reach out to and help with that process too. It's great. It's great to have community when you're going through something like this.
Totally. And I just want to say, Jeana, you've been really validating to me personally and to our Get Wise support group and our community in just really validating the ways we've been wronged and helping us then name those things and work through them. So I just want to thank you for that, Jeana. And thank you. Well, thank you for today. This has just been really, really great, really helpful. And I want to thank everyone for being here. Such great questions. Thank you to Jack for being our technical director here and helping make all this possible. Jeana, thanks for your presentation. And also, I just want to encourage you to walk with us in recovery. If what Jeana talked about, what we talked about here, really resonates with you, it's so important to do this in community. And we're going to have support groups starting up again in the fall, and we'd love for you to walk with us. I also want to thank our supporters. Our supporters help make this possible. We really can't do it without people's generosity. And we actually have a fundraiser right now if you want to help support the creation of more webinars like these, helping us partner with experts like Jeana and the Pardons. We just would really love for you to consider supporting this work through it's the Get Wise Project through the Fellowship of Former Christian Scientists. You can donate or become a monthly partner. So do consider that. And we just thank you all for being here today and hope you have a great rest of your day. Hope you'll join us next time. Thanks for walking with us in recovery. Bye for now.